Now let's do some animation in Maya. We're going to start off by taking a look at the animation interface. Now the animation interface is centered around the timeline, which is typically at the bottom of the screen. So we have this time slider here, and if we left click and drag, we can drag through our animation. Now if we want to, we can also play back that animation. So we have all of our playback controls here on the bottom right. And so we can play forwards, we can play backwards, we can also step through one key at a time. Now if I select this object, you'll see that on the timeline we have these little red ticks, and those represent keys. Those are places where we've animated the object. So if we step through a key at a time, we can do that. We can also step through a frame at a time. And we can also jump to the beginning or the end of the animation. Now the timeline itself is a little bit flexible, so we have along the bottom what's called the range slider. And if you notice, we have two sets of numbers. One set of numbers on the outside and one on the inside. Now the outside numbers determine the total length of the animation. So if I were to, say, type in a different number, I would make the actual total animation a little bit longer. Now inside of these we have what's called the range, and this is what portion of that animation we're looking at. Right now this is set from frame 1 to frame 60, but I could type in two numbers, say 10 to 40, and notice how this little slider changes and we're actually zooming in on the timeline. Now this slider can also be used to navigate the timeline. Right now, again, we're looking from 10 to 40, but if I slide it, I can really look at any portion of that timeline. Now, if you want to grow and shrink it, we have two handles, one at the beginning and one at the end, and these allow us to zoom in or zoom out on your timeline. Now, the range slider is really important because it allows you to zoom in on your timeline. And if you have a really long animation sequence, it makes sense to zoom in and work on only those parts you need. Now over to the right-hand side, we have a couple of other controls here. The first one is our speed setting. So by default, this is set to 24 frames a second, but we can set it to really just about any standard frame rate. So we can set it to 29.97, 30, we can set it lower, we can set it to 12 frames per second, and so on. And then we also have a loop, so we can do continuous loop. We can do loop once, so in other words, I play it, and then it stops. I can do oscillating loop, which plays it forwards, then plays it backwards, which is kind of neat. And then over here on the far right, I have what's called an auto keyframe toggle. When I toggle that on, anytime you move the object, you will set a keyframe. And we'll get into keyframes in just a little bit. But by keeping this on, anytime you adjust an object, you're essentially animating it. And then finally, we have our animation preferences. Now, when I click on this, it actually brings us into our main preferences window. And this is another way to get into that window. But when you click on animation preferences, it brings you immediately to the time slider. So in this time slider window, we can further control how animation is played back. Again, we have a frame rate slider, so we can change the frame rate to whatever we want. And when we change the frame rate, we can turn on keep keys at current frame. So that way it doesn't give you fractional frames if you change your frame rate. We can also change our playback and our range start and end right here. And then we can also change the way that the time slider looks. So if we want, we can give it a height of 1, 2, or 4. So we can actually make it really big if we want to see that. And then we can also change whether or not we have key ticks. So if I select this object, notice the little red vertical lines. Well, we can certainly turn those off. We can turn them on, or we can turn them on only to those things that are in the current channel box. And then we can also make them bigger or smaller. Now, typically I like to keep them big so that they're visible, but you can do it 1, 2, or 3 times. Then our time display, by default it's frames, but you also can do time code. And then most importantly is playback speed. Now, the playback speed is determined on the frame rate, but it's actually, do we want to play every single frame? And that's kind of like a wild playback. So if I play it back on this one, you'll see that it plays back actually quicker than you would normally play back. If we want to, we can say play back at exactly 24 frames per second. And that will go ahead and slow that down. Or we can play at half speed, which is times 0.5. So it'll play even slower. Or we can play at double speed, which is times 2. And that'll play a little bit faster. I usually like to keep it on times 1 so I have an accurate playback. And then we also have update view. Do we want to just update the active view, which is a little bit faster? Or if you're in multiple viewports, such as this, do you want to update all of the viewports? Now, typically I animate in my camera viewport, so typically I keep it on active, but you can do it on either. And then we can also change looping here. We can loop once, we can oscillate, and notice how this is changing, or continuous. So those are some of the basics of the animation interface. And Maya gives you a lot of flexibility in how you play back and view your animation.